No, I do no belong.
Can you
I
hear me?
went to. I was went to.
The microphone's on.
How about now?
Perfect.
Okay. Welcome, everybody. This is our opportunity to hear from Mr. Chris Fabricant. Chris is the Innocence Project in New York's Director of Strategic Litigation, and he's done tremendous litigation all around the country, challenging forensic science that we once thought was reliable and now understand no longer is. And recently he's written this book, Junk Science and the American Criminal Legal System, and I highly recommend everyone to read it. He is going to tell us a little bit about the book and how he came to write the book now. So Chris, why did you write the book?
That's a good question. Thanks. Thank you for having me. I'm delighted so many of you came out. I wrote the book for a couple of reasons. One is that I knew that I was having extraordinary experiences in litigating extraordinary cases in places that most lawyers don't have an opportunity to litigate, in tiny towns in the Mississippi Delta and in other parts of the Deep South, and where you can really see the way that forensic science is misused, the way that racism plays out in very subtle ways in some parts of the country and very overt ways in other parts of the country. And so much of what I do at the Innocence Project is education. It's what we all do. And when we talk a lot about in the book about storytelling and what storytelling does, and that's really how human beings understand the world around us, is that we tell ourselves stories, that we connect dots between, that should or should not be connected perhaps, but that's really what's persuasive, is that when we learn things through storytelling. That's why trial attorneys are persuasive, and I wanted to write a book that was storytelling, but that had messages for the reader that were beyond a Law and Order or CSI or Forensic Files or one of these things that tell these nice, neat, wrapped up stories with perfect forensic sciences that convicted the bad guy. And so it's an effort really to debunk, CSI and Forensic Files and those types of things, and I sometimes tell this story because it's so insane. But we watch, the lawyers in my department watch Forensic Files, not for entertainment, but for casework, right? We watch these shows, and twice we've taken cases that we saw on those shows and they looked innocent to us because we're skeptical about the forensics. So Alfred Swinton is featured on Forensic Files, thought to be a serial killer. And I avoided taking the case for a while because it was such a notorious crime in Connecticut, and they were trying to put 8 bodies on him. He was only convicted on 1 murder, though, and that was used in Bitemark. And, when we picked it up, it's almost like an intake for us, right? That 16 weeks or 16 months later, he was exonerated. And yet, that Forensic Files, you could still see it years later. He was out, he'd been exonerated. I reached out to Bill Curtis, the guy from Wait, Don't Tell Me. He's also, on the Forensic Files. And I got his email from our comms people. I was like, Bill, take this down, right? He's innocent, right? He never got back to me. But, so it's an effort really to, call it an untrue crime genre, right?
So you've done many cases all around the country, challenging many different forensic sciences. In your book, you touch on many of the different disciplines, and I use that term loosely, that are considered forensic science, but you really focus on Bitemark evidence. Why did you choose Bitemarks?
Well, I was hired to start the Strategic Litigation Department in 2012, and the idea is that the group of lawyers that worked in my department were going to be challenging the leading contributing causes of wrongful conviction. So we know that eyewitness misidentification is a leading contributing factor, false confessions, and forensic sciences. All right, and so the lawyers in my department litigate all of these areas, and my focus had always been to start the initiative to really start trying to litigate against the admissibility. So we would do Fry hearings and Daubert hearings, but we also do post-conviction litigation. And so when we decided that what forensics we were going to focus on, there was a big debate internally between Barry Scheck and Peter Neufeld primarily, right? Those are the co-founders of the Innocence Project. And I was in the room for these debates, and allegedly my opinion mattered. But it was really there was good reasons why we should have been challenging fingerprint evidence. we can talk about fingerprint evidence at some point. I'm not calling it junk science, but there are misapplications of fingerprint evidence that can be very problematic. But they also can be used to exonerate people, right, through AFIS uploads if you have an alternative suspect whose fingerprints are found at the scene. So it can be used kind of both ways. It can be misused and overstated, and particularly when you have low-quality evidence, or it can be used if you find it and it can be uploaded to identify an alternative suspect, similar to the way that we use CODIS hits, right? And then Peter, that was Barry's idea, right? Peter thought bite marks are the junkiest of this, and that we'd already had a bunch of wrongful convictions, and that we should try to just pick that off, eliminate the use of bite mark evidence completely. Peter's argument prevailed, and then I set about to learn everything I could about bite mark evidence, right? So if you're ever, as law students, when you're going into practice and you have a particular area that you're going to be working in, I beg you to read the original cases, all the source material, because you'd be astonished by what you'll learn by really going to the source and reading the source material. It separates the good lawyers from the great lawyers, is the people that really aren't relying on other people's interpretations, but are going to what actually happened. And so when I looked at bite mark evidence, you could see there was a case in California, Marks, right, that is amongst the worst forensic science decisions ever published in our criminal legal system. And I traced all of that through the court systems, and you could see the way it just spread like a dirty bomb, across like a virus, really, across the country, and was cited by all these other cases, and all the precedent-establishing cases, and state after state after state after state. And that logic, I'll call it, right, or the reasoning that they used here was that bite mark evidence is so elementary, right, that it's not like whiz-bang technology that would be confusing or mislead a juror. It was just pattern matching, right? And so we don't need to scrutinize it the same way we would other evidence, right? And that a jury is not going to be misled by this. And so that reasoning was adopted, not just for bite marks, but for shoe prints, for tire treads, for hair microscopy, for all these other pattern matching techniques, and kind of shielded it from scrutiny. And you could see the influence of one bite mark decision it had just on the entire justice system, and for really today, right? We were litigating a case in Alabama, Charles McCrory, and that we're doing with the Southern Center for Human Rights. And Mr. McCrory, and this is really, and we'll focus I think a little bit on this, on the statute and the legislation that's pending in California right now. It's important as it relates to this story I'm about to tell, is that when you don't have DNA evidence, it's very, very, very challenging to overturn a junk science conviction, because judges, rely on case law to make decisions about what's good and what's bad science. Science, of course, is a process. It's always moving forward, always discarding previously held beliefs when they've been falsified by new evidence, or new scientific research. It's a dynamic process. Case law isn't like that. And trying to undo that is the challenge, is to get a state court trial-level judge, probably an elected judge, to overturn a century of unanimous precedent that admitted just junk science. So we did this with Charles McCrory's case, because we were making great progress on bite marks. We're almost eliminated, and so we're now litigating the tough cases. Places like Alabama, where post-conviction litigation is very, very challenging. It's challenging everywhere, but there are jurisdictions that are harder than others. And so Mr. McCrory was convicted of murdering his wife. He was no motive, no prior violence, no no witnesses, no evidence to speak of. The hairs in the victim's hands were not Charles McCrory's, and they were not the victim's hairs. There's an alternative suspect that was next door to lurking construction next door that was known to wear a red bandana. That bandana was found, or a red bandana was found next to the victim's body. That person, 5 weeks later, did a home invasion rape and served 20 years in prison. He's already done his time. And right before we're starting, and the only evidence that was used was bite mark evidence by a dentist that's discussed in the book, who was made famous by testifying in Ted Bundy's case. He testified during the same era against another client of mine and Mr. McCrory, and he recanted his opinion. To his credit, he recanted his opinion. So there's nothing left, right? And so we're going to the evidentiary hearing, and on the eve of the evidentiary hearing, he's offered a time-served plea. He's been in for 37 years. Could walk home. that day. He wouldn't do it. He wouldn't plead guilty to something that he didn't do. It's his 2-year-old son found his mother's body. How do you go home and say, you know, I pled guilty, but I didn't mean it? And like his son believes in his innocence. And so we did the evidentiary hearing, and we lost. They cut and pasted the prosecutor's brief into the opinion, and now Mr. McQuarrie is, you know, may spend the rest of his life in prison. So part of the reason that, you know, it's important for us to talk to young students that are going to be lawyers and how important it is to be scientifically literate and to have challenges at the beginning and how hard it is to undo in the end.
That's a terrible story, and that's
Sorry.
one thing that's it's important. And one thing I noted about the book is that they're not all happy endings, the stories that you tell. There are many challenging cases left out there, or clients who've died while they were in prison. So, but I was struck by how much research you did do into the forensic odontology and the history of the odontologists, and not just the legal history, but how they came to be who they are. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Did you learn anything doing the book?
I did.
Okay.
So yeah, it's a fascinating. What I really was interested in, and I got off track. I guess you asked me that, and now I'll get back to it. But the what I wanted to show through the kind of focus on Bitemark Evidence was how junk science gets into court to begin with. It's not just that one case. You know, that case wasn't an accident. That case, they were looking for that case. And what it was is that, you know, in the 60s, the forensic scientist became a viable profession. It was something that you could aspire to be. And the Sam Shepard trial was really the first where forensic scientists had taken the stand, and it was a media frenzy. And it was like a lot of circumstantial evidence cases relied a lot on forensic sciences. And during that time, and for a long time, forensic dentists have been working in the medical examiner's office, the local medical examiner's offices. So you see something like a story about a body burned beyond recognition, and they could only be identified through their dental records. That's a forensic dentist that does that. You know, local forensic dentist goes down to, they usually have an interest in crime solving or in forensics or something like that, and civic-minded people for the most part, and don't get paid a lot of money to do that, and they do a public service. So they're working with the forensic pathologists. These are kind of their mentors. These are medical doctors. And there's a lot of, you know, unreliable stuff happening in forensic pathology. I touch on it a little in the book, but it's not a focus. But the forensic pathologists were the ones that were becoming stars and becoming expert witnesses. Quincy was a hugely popular show at the time, right? You know what I mean? And so this was that era. And the dentists were, you know, wanted a slice of the pie. And they started looking to bite marks that they were seeing or thought they were looking at on victims' bodies in morgues, and thinking that, hey, we know teeth, right? And this could be an identification, you know, process, right? So we can match the teeth that made these bite marks. We would have a good chance of catching the perpetrator. And so they started having little conferences, you know, I mean, little seminars that, you know, dentists get together like every other field, you know, and they started promoting this as an idea. And so the forensic pathologists who were already established gave them opportunities to do casework, gave them opportunities to publish in medical journals and that kind of thing. And then what I looked for in the book was like, okay, well, where did it begin? So then they came to the American Academy of Forensic Sciences, and they persuaded them to have an odontology section. Forensic odontology, which is what these guys like to call themselves, right? It's very fancy sounding, but these are just dentists that are looking at bite marks, right? And so, but they have like a forensic odontology department, or a section, their own section, you know, shoulder to shoulder with, you know, trace evidence and forensic pathology and biology and all the rest, right? The odontology, still today, you know, I was there recently, have their own section. But they got that section through their use for their victim identification work, right? That's the real technique. But then they had a credential. Right, they were, you know, you could be the chair of the Forensic Odontology Department or section of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences. And then they created a board certifying entity, the American Board of Forensic Odontology, and started certifying each other, all without demonstrating that they could actually do this, all without any scientific research. But then they had two credentials, right? They had the American Academy of Forensic Sciences, they were board certified with the ABFO, And you'd call them doctor, right? You know what I mean? So it's all the more impressive. And credentials are everything. You know what I mean? You walk in, some laundry list, people have no idea like what it means to be board certified and if that matters or doesn't matter. That's what happened with the first case. So when they got to Walter Marks, that was the California case, you know, you had people that had these credentials that suggested that this is an established area of science, when of course it was not, it was just invented, right? Gets into case law, and the rest, you know, then the next thing that happened is something that I walk through a lot, and is the Ted Bundy case. Another, like, kind of Sam Shepard and then Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy is the first nationally televised trial in the country. And, you know, it's still today. You know, I mean, you can sell a lot of movie tickets by talking about Ted Bundy. And so I looked at, I don't know, do you guys use newspapers.com? But it's a great, for those of you who do post-conviction research, one of the things that I suggest that you do is get a subscription to newspapers.com, because it goes back to like the late 40s. And it's every newspaper, like tiny presses all over. And you can see, you know, what there might be alternative suspects that were reported, or like new evidence that you missed, Brady, that like trails that you can find through that. So it's fascinating. So I did this with Ted Bundy, and I went and I looked at everything about him. I know more about Ted Bundy now than I was like, and what was astonishing to me is that when he finally gets arrested in Florida after what became known as the Cayo murders, right? And so it was very sensational. Like 2 women murdered in their beds in or two women survived attacks in the beds in the Cayo murders. Is one of the very few people that survived. And there were no witnesses, though. There was no forensic evidence. There was no confession. The only person that made an identification had previously identified an employee of Chi Omega under hypnosis as the person that she saw fleeing the house. But then when Ted Bundy got arrested, they're like, "Hey, is this the guy?" Right? And it's, yes, right. And you know, it probably did it. I'm not suggesting he's innocent. Broken clocks are right twice a day. But they had nothing else. And so the case rose and fell on the forensic dentist testimony, and as a result, they became stars. They're media heroes, and then they started sweeping out across the country. So that's really the story, how it all happened, right? You know, it was like part of it was strategic and part of it was luck.
So one thing, I'm going to read a line from your book, because in order to put this into context, you also remind us that in the 70s, and I'm quoting you here, even most mainstream medicine had not moved into evidence-based practices. I think many of our people would be surprised to hear that evidence-based medicine was not a thing. What was it? And what did doctors rely on?
Yeah, I was astonished by this too, to a degree. You know, and I use a phrase that was actually from Freakonomics radio, right? Is like as evidence-based wisdom as opposed to evidence-based wisdom. And this is true with a lot of forensics. And we talk about forensic guilds, and this is true in medicine, is that where you have very prominent practitioners of fields and that are espousing particular wisdom and techniques for, you know, identifying, diagnosing, and treating particular ailments, right? You know, and some of that wisdom in medicine was sound, and some of it wasn't, because there wasn't real solid research to back up so much of the claims that were being made. Randomized controlled testing had not been really invented as something that you should be doing in medicine. And so they had centuries of received wisdom that had never really been subject to scrutiny outside of mainstream science. And what happened was there was something called the Corcoran Collective, which is a little bit like what happened with the National Academy of Sciences when they looked at forensic sciences. But the Corcoran Collective looked at all of the received literature in medicine for hundreds of years. And similar to the way the NAS found in forensics that it was really lacking in a solid research foundation. And some of like the most commonly thought to be diagnoses were wrong. And the medical community went bananas, right? Because who are these statisticians and not medical doctors telling us what we should be doing? And they were really resistant to the idea of evidence-based medicine. And what was a great line that I quoted from this, and it was what they were talking about in this interview that I was listening on Freakonomics, was one of the authors of this report said, I'm getting all this heat from the medical community. And, what should I do? He's like, when your customers start asking for, if your customers are going to be happy with evidence-based medicine, or if they want like eminence-based medicine, you will know, right, is that the customers are going to want this. It doesn't matter what the dentists want or what the forensic or what the doctors want. The customers want evidence-based medicine. If you are going to get a cancer treatment, do you want somebody who's claiming that this works, or do you want scientific research that shows that it does, right? Of course you want the latter. So that's the lack of evidence-based medicine these were the mentors of the Bitemark guys, right? So they're received, like the way that they were learning the trade was always based on an apprenticeship that you would have with a master. And when you have that type of apprenticeship, you rely on them for casework, for your credentials, to get you into the business at all. And typically, that's a revered person, the mentor who brought me into this field. And so it creates this dynamic where you're not going to be questioning that wisdom either, right? You're not taught to be questioning it. You're taught this is the way that it is. And so you end up with perpetuating myths that aren't based on real science. And it was similar in medicine, to a large degree today. And it took a long, long time for medicine to really pivot to much more evidence-based work because people like us demanded it, right? Of course. And in the criminal legal system, who are the customers, right? It's law enforcement. And law enforcement is largely satisfied with the status quo. And people like us aren't. And so this is the same struggle that we're having now, and the stakes are very, very similar.
So these cases around the country exposed Bitemark Evidence as being junk science. There have been many other disciplines that were exposed through casework. And in the mid-2000s, the National Academy of Sciences decided to take a look at these so-called forensic sciences. Can you tell us in a nutshell what they found and what it led to?
Yeah, I probably should have had this talked about this before we were talking about the Corcoran Collective, but yes, it began in 2006, and I tell some of the stories about the people who came and testified before the committee that Congress, actually mandated this study to be done. And the National Academy of Sciences is the most prestigious scientific organization in our country, maybe in the world. It was established by Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War. And a lot of scientists, their greatest life achievement would be a member of the National Academy of Sciences. So, but we know in criminal law, that you could have Albert Einstein could descend into the courtroom and say that this is junk science, and they wouldn't believe it, right? They'd go like the dentist. But what happened was really largely the result of forensic DNA arrival in the criminal legal system and the Innocence Project's founding, and your project, which was pretty close shortly after the first one, started exonerating people. And what was astonishing to really the entire world was that it revealed how fallible our criminal legal system is, right? And it was really important, the intake criteria at that time was that they were going to take any case where if they found biological evidence and tested it, that it would prove innocent. So it didn't matter if they confessed. Didn't matter if there were 6 eyewitnesses. Didn't matter if all the forensics that wasn't DNA pointed at them, they were going to test it. And it exposed forensics as being much less reliable than previously thought to be. And, there was, people like Professor Starr and Barry and Peter in New York knew this and known this for quite a while, that some of these techniques had led to wrongful convictions. But there had never been really a systemic review of all forensics that were being used in the United States. There had never been outside scientists, mainstream scientists that aren't making their living testifying as expert witnesses or have no stake in the continued admissibility of these techniques, that went and did essentially a literature review of all 13 different forensic techniques that are the most commonly used in the United States. So like Bitemarks, hair comparison, firearms and tool marks, arson, what else? It went on and on. Did I say fingerprints, right? So all fingerprints, all trace evidence, right? So what they found essentially, and as you'll hear, today there'll be somebody in court right now testifying that that bullet was shot by that gun to the exclusion of every other gun in the history of time that's been ever manufactured. That's called individualization. And what the NAS report found in 2009, that there was no technique, zero, that was capable of identifying the source of crime scene evidence to the exclusion of all others. DNA doesn't even make that claim, and that the only valid, reliable, and demonstrated to be reliable forensic technique currently in use in 2009 was DNA evidence. So it was a stunning, it reverberates still today. Every forensic conference I ever go to, every brief I ever write, talks about the NAS report. It's the, foundational document to almost all of the litigation that I do.
One of the things that the NAS report did was criticize the courts as abdicating their responsibility in assessing what techniques should be admissible and should not. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, how many of you are no statistics? Right. How many of you are taking science classes here in law school? Right. How many of you came to law school because there's no science? Right. So widespread scientific illiteracy is a huge problem in the United States. Lawyers are hardly an exception, maybe even noted for their lack of scientific training. And really, you can't do that anymore. If you want to practice criminal law, really any law, but when you have somebody's life in your hands, you have to understand the science. There's no way around it. You are all law students. You all have great reading comprehension. If you have great reading comprehension, you can read scientific literature. It's boring, but you can understand it. You don't have to be a genius to do that, And I've become more and more convinced of that the longer I've been doing that work. But so judges, though, and one of the points that I make in the book, is like on this theme that I explore called poor people science, is that there are a lot of reasons why forensics continue to be introduced. We talked a little bit about legal precedent, but so Kelly Fry is your test here, and what the Kelly is the application piece, right? Fry, it's regular Fry, and then Kelly is like as applied. Mm-hmm. So I'm just going to talk about the regular Fry aspect, and this is general acceptance in the relevant scientific community, and what that is a judge is not supposed to, under a Fry analysis, do an independent review of the science at issue. What they do is they look to the relevant scientific community and they count noses. They say, is this generally accepted? Is this technique within the scientific community generally accepted? Now, can you think of what the outcome determinative finding would be in that? Anybody? What would matter most? It's how you define the relevant scientific community, right? So if you define it as the practitioners themselves, right, the people who invented this stuff and are making their living doing it and are going into court and testifying as expert witnesses, the answer as to whether or not their technique is generally accepted is going to be very obvious, right? So what was astonishing to me is that it's always, that's how they define it, right? The people who made it up, right? Which is just crazy, and totally indefensible, scientifically indefensible and morally indefensible because it leads to the continued use of evidence that we know leads to wrongful conviction. So that's one reason. And why do they do that, right? Is that, because one of the points that I try to make, and I also make it in litigation, and you should be looking at civil decisions when you're talking about scientific evidence because they should apply, because science is science, right? You don't get special poor people science for the criminal legal system and different science for the civil system, but that's what actually happens, is that the courts are much more likely to get it right when money is at issue than when life and liberty are at issue. And it's empirically demonstrated. I did a research project with Brandon Garrett, a prominent scholar in this field, and the evidence shows that that's exactly right, and that the defense almost loses their challenges every single time. Prosecution almost always gets it in. And this is because law and order judges are still the norm. Most of them are elected. Most violent crime is prosecuted in state court. That's where the most junkiest of the sciences are used. And nobody is going to seek to overturn precedent. And so, you and I were talking about this earlier, is that you can't separate, junk from real science in the adversarial system. It's a terrible place to work it out, because we're required to be biased on behalf of our clients. That's our job, right? That's your goal is to do everything it must be to meet your client's ethical means or ethical goals. And prosecutors, once you go into trial, the gloves are off. They want to win too, and they're going to use the techniques that are admissible, right? And so they may have some subjective, notion that it may or may not be reliable, but they're required as a matter of ethics to subjectively believe in the guilt of the people that they're prosecuting, right? So once you do that, almost, they're going to take the tools that the legal system provides them, and they're going to prosecute. And so all of this is a mix of, a formula for junk science to continue to be used.
So we in California have had representative cases of each of these junk sciences, and we at NCIP have litigated many of these cases, including arson, microscopic hair comparison junk, and continue to do it with our shaken baby syndrome abusive head trauma cases. In fact, have a large research and litigation project focused on that bad science. But one of our frustrations has been the way the legal system doesn't support our efforts to challenge these cases. And so we have, over the years, introduced legislation to try to fix the post-conviction opportunities to address these problems. You've been involved in part of those efforts. And we are constantly trying to make that legislation better. Because of that, we currently have some legislation pending. And NCIP's legislation advocate is here with us, Missy O'Connell, Professor O'Connell. Can you tell us in a nutshell, Missy, what the legislation we have pending will do?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everyone. Usually I don't need a microphone when I talk. But I'll come up just real quick just for visual on this. But SB 467 is a bill that we have currently pending. It is authored by Senator Weiner, who is in San Francisco, and Senator Kamlager. What the bill does, and I love the words that Chris has been floating around, he keeps talking about scrutiny and going back to the beginning and looking at what the experts are relying on. And that's exactly what SB 467, the goals of SB 467. What we're trying to do is further clarify what false testimony means when it comes to forensic science, which isn't just about advancements in technology, but when NAS did their report, they scrutinized their own work and said when we used to testify and say that we can exclude everyone else in the world, we were overstating the power of this science. And it wasn't necessarily because of advancements, it was just them doing what good scientists do, which is scrutinizing their own work. The courts don't necessarily keep up with that level of scrutiny. And so SB 467 is to account for that so that people who have been convicted on things that are not as reliable as we once believed them to be, they have a path for seeking relief. The other piece that is really huge for SB 467 is we're creating a habeas path that accounts for when there's an emergence of a dispute within these relevant scientific communities that Chris is talking about, because there are factions within these communities as to the reliability of the methodologies or the even existence of some medical diagnoses like SBS AHT or forensic science, which really gets it to the heart of reliability. And those of you that have gone through con law, reliability is at the heart of our due process clause. And that's really not giving the protection to wrongfully convicted people that we need in our state. So SB 467 is in hopes of achieving a statutory path for us to challenge unreliable evidence. So, thank you.
So why don't we there's a QR code there for you to scan if you want to support our bill. It's pending now, and we would love any support we can get from any of you here or any of you listening in on our live stream. The legislators do care about public support, so it does help if you provide us with that public support. I think I'll just open it up for questions now. If anybody has any questions for Chris, anything you'd like to say before we do that?
While you're hopefully coming up with some new questions, the one thing that I would just talk about how important this bill is the Stephen Chaney case. That's one of the backbone stories in junk science is relied on the junk science writ. This is what they call it in Texas. And it was the first bill of its kind in that country, and because, what we were talking about earlier with non-DNA cases, where Stephen Chaney presented 9 alibi witnesses at trial, but junk science was enough to overcome it all. And, we didn't have definitive DNA evidence in this case. It's very, very hard to overturn. And so we used this statute was helped prove an innocent man who spent 28 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit was benefited by the passage of this type of a law. So it's urgent, and certainly California can do it as well as Texas can do it. So they should pass it forthwith.
Which is usually what we say up at the Capitol.
So if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to. And it could be, Innocence Project stuff or whatever. It doesn't have to be about my book. Yeah, sure.
Hi. I probably find the answer in your book, but albeit junk science, have you had cases on bite marks about which I know nothing, where it's been proven that analysis was right through DNA or some other testing? Just how junky is it, I guess is the question.
It's funny, and I know you didn't mean it this way, is that I get that question from dentists a lot. You never talk about the times we get it right. Right? And it's like, okay. So, we don't talk about the airplanes that land safely in the airport, right? We talk about the plane crashes. Sure, that happens. And if you have a DNA test with as amylase, there's like an enzyme that's found in very prominent in saliva that demonstrates, or tends to demonstrate that it was the biter whose DNA you're talking about is and has been appropriately identified as that person. But it was the DNA that showed that it was right. And I'm so kind of steeped in Bitemark stuff. I forget sometimes that I need to persuade people that it actually is junk science. But just think about it, and this is one of the problems that I urge you all to maintain a hold on your skepticism. Like, law students and lawyers are the most skeptical people that I know, but it goes out the window when they're confronted with scientific evidence for whatever reason, right? Suddenly they're just accepting everything that's said to them by an expert. But if you think about, a skin, these injuries are made they're found on the bodies of a murder victim or they're on an assault victim who survived. When the forensic dentist comes and photographs that injury has changed dramatically, right? So from the time it was inflicted during some violent struggle, and maybe partial, and so it's gone through a healing process, and it's swelled, and it's changed over time, and it looks different than it was when it first. So you could have teeth that matched one day and didn't match the next day, right? But it just happened to on the day that, and it's a subjective judgment anyway, that it's taking a photograph. On a body that's been decomposing, right? Skin is shrinking, and we don't know what it looked like, what angle is inflicted at the same time. So it's impossible to match somebody to something like that, right? And then there's research that came out that was devastating to the whole field that showed the threshold issue, right? Because you all have in your mind right now, I'll bet, what a bite mark looks like, right? So maybe you've seen toddlers getting home from day school, right? Somebody's bitten them, right? And you can see all those individual teeth, right? I have never seen that in casework. Never, right? You just get these diffuse bruises that could be anything. They did a research project that they having done, is the ABFO, that's the Board Certifying Entity, participated in this, and 40 of the most experienced bite mark experts in the planet took 100 cases, and they looked at, and they were asked one question. Is this a bite mark, not a bite mark, or inconclusive? And we don't know ground truth. Ground truth means that you were there, you saw something happen, that it's a verifiable fact, right? And you don't know if something is a bite mark or is not a bite mark if you weren't there. The only way that you can demonstrate reliability is having experts that are similarly trained, similarly experienced, looking at the same evidence, come to, it doesn't mean identical conclusions, but are relatively reliable between expert to expert to expert. It's called inter-rater reliability in science, they call it that. And so, if you're basically, all these experts are looking at this and they're saying, yeah, that's a bite mark, in my experience I've seen this, right? What happened was like flipping a coin. They were all over, right? Some said it was, some said it wasn't. One of the ones in that study that there was the most unanimity on was the only one that they knew ground truth, because this guy had cut himself with a box cutter and said, well, this kind of looks like a bite mark to me, and he included it in the study. And they all thought it was a bite mark, and it wasn't, right? So there's nothing to bite marks. Don't believe it if you hear it.
One of the stories that you tell in your book is about the forensic odontologist that was cross-examined by now Judge Chris Plourde. You want to talk just for a minute about what former attorney Plourde was able to do with that odontologist?
Yeah, well, Judge Plourde is it wasn't across, it was the sting is what you're referring to, right? So Michael West is a villain in the book. You know, if you ever want like to read an insane deposition toward the end of the book, you know, this is a madman who's, you know, from Mississippi who is calling me an asswipe under oath. You know, what I mean, like, this kind of, he just went completely bananas. So that's one story, but he had already been discredited by the time he and I were in that room together, and really, apart from a couple of wrongful convictions, that Chris Plourde was the defense attorney for Ray Crone, who was convicted and sentenced to death in Arizona on Bitemark Evidence, not by Dr. West. But he was so incensed by what had happened, and he knew firsthand, you know, the risk, you know, that this junk science was posing on innocent people. And he decided to conduct kind of a sting, or what we were calling when we were litigating these cases, a blind proficiency test. And what he did is that he engaged Michael West with the evidence from Ray Crone's case, the bite mark in that case, or the alleged bite mark, and his investigator, a mold of his investigator's teeth, right, that he lived in Utah, who could not have done this bite mark. And he sent West $750 and asked him, you know, like it was like, you know, there was doing an investigation for somebody whose daughter was missing, something, I can't remember exactly what it was, the context it was given. But the suggested context was, and we haven't talked much about cognitive bias, but this plays a huge role in forensics as well, but the context was that, you know, he was kind of looking for a match. And a couple weeks later, West returns his video, and he matches his investigator's teeth to this bite mark, to the exclusion that the odds of somebody else making this bite mark were astronomical, and it's all on videotape. And it was astonishing. It was like a charlatan caught in the act, right, of like inventing this stuff. And we know that would have been admissible in court. It's admissible in court today, right? That same nonsense. I played that video in the Eddie Lee Howard case, which is the last case in the book that I spent a lot of time with. I played that video in open court to a judge who had presided over 2 of Michael West's other wrongful convictions, showing the judge. It's astonishing I was able to get it into evidence, but showing the judge is like, this is Michael West at work, right? Right? This is, you could see with your own eyes, right? Denies relief.
You have kind of given some different ideas, but strategy-wise, when you are confronted with a case with junk science, what have you seen in these cases that is successful? Like, is it a matter of finding the perfect expert? Do you kind of have to like hope for a recantation? What has been successful?
Well, it's a great question. There are lots of different things you have to do with these types of cases. One of the important advances that we made in bite marks was we had like a lot of, you know, these are by and large, you know, with notable exceptions, not bad people that are doing, they're well-intended civil servants that are performing these forensic techniques. And if you have people that are willing to listen, it's a very hard thing to do, to be told, you know, by somebody, some slick New York lawyer that you got no science, right? You know what I mean? So that if you have people that are willing to listen and willing to change their mind and willing to question the foundations of what they've been taught, that's the most important, right? Because sadly, courts pay attention to experts within the field that are, look, the only reason the FBI hair microscopy audit or that hair comparison evidence became notably discredited is because the FBI admitted it. There had already been 70 wrongful convictions before they came out. 70, right, before they came out with it. So if you can persuade people from within the field to either like denounce the field itself by showing them real data, or that the evidence in your particular case was misapplied in this way, those are opinions. Recantation, of course, is an important thing. And barring that, if you need an expert witness or an expert witness opinion and you can't find them within the field because, right now, firearms and tool marks is, we've been working a lot on handheld tools, and one of the cases I talk about in the book a little bit is Jimmy Gamrick, who was convicted of a series of pipe bombings. And the only evidence that connects him to those pipe bombings are his handheld tool evidence, which in a tiny, tiny mark, and they said that his wire stripper is the only wire strippers in the world that could have made this tiny, it was 1/100th of an inch, right? No other. So I searched for 3 years in advance of this evidentiary hearing for somebody within that community, somebody that would be willing to say that you can't do that, right? That's too, not even to denounce the field, but to say that mark, that the threat of like another random tool matching this is too great to that's grossly overstated. I couldn't find one. And can you understand why? Right? Because they're making their living doing this, right? This is like their life's work, and that nobody's going to come out and, discredit a technique like that, or an opinion like that. So we have to bring in mainstream scientists. People who understand. We had Dean Fakeman from Hastings came and testified, and we had E.T.L. Drawers, a famous cognitive neuroscientist, testified. And you get experts in the scientific method. People that understand science, people that understand research, people who understand how forensic technique can be validated scientifically, and they can break down kind of the fundamental assumptions. Whenever I look at a new technique that I'm not familiar with, I try to break it out to ways that here's everything that has to be true for this to be a valid opinion, right? So if you think about it in terms of bite marks, it's they have to be able to say that this is a bite mark, right? So that's but they also have to be able to say this is an adult's bite mark versus a child's bite mark, right? And they also have to be able to say, how much has this mark changed over time? So if you could predict that it's going to swell 3 millimeters, then maybe you can make some judgments, right? And then how often, things like that, right? Your fundamental assumptions. And then look for the research on that, right? And so you have to be able to work with the experts that are in the field. And often, what I encourage students and other attorneys to do is just go to your local university and talk to the statistics experts, right? They're usually pretty well-versed in research design, and they're also pretty good in analyzing validation research that's been done, and to point out, if it's flawed, where the flaws are. So most mainstream scientists, when they're looking at forensic evidence, can see where where it's lacking, and they don't have any vested interest in it. And so often we'll find ourselves recruiting from scientists who haven't been practicing in the field for 20 years, but have a real understanding of science. And then you run into what we've been talking about earlier. Sometimes it's it's like the joke I was making about Albert Einstein, right? It's just he's never done a bite mark case. What the hell does Albert Einstein know, right? We don't know bite marks.
Thank you.
And you should call me. That's what I always say. I'd be happy to help, right? Anybody else?
I just have a question. So one of the things that I think we struggle with a lot in our work is that the scientist isn't just given the scientific data and information. They're sort of given more facts about the case and the context. And so how much have you found, I'm curious because you do this very deeply, that the scientist is influenced by sort of the tangential facts about the case, trying to fit the science into the context? Because I feel like it's a huge struggle.
Huge struggle. It was one of the other findings of the NES report that is hugely controversial within the forensic community as well, which is astonishing to me, although that's maybe a strong word because nothing is surprising anymore. But we are all, all forensics have a certain amount of subjectivity to them, and some much more than others. Some are entirely subjective. But there are many techniques that are entirely subjective. And what you get is when a technique is subjective, we are going to be influenced by facts that are outside of what you're actually just looking at under the microscope. And the best example of this that I talk about in the book is the Brandon Mayfield, the most well-known misidentification. Brandon Mayfield is a lawyer in Portland who his fingerprints were matched to blast caps of a bombing that was done in a commuter train in Spain in 2004. he'd never been to Spain, right? You know what I mean? And, you know, he happened to be Muslim, and he happened to have represented some people that had been connected to terrorism at one point, but he was plainly innocent, but the FBI had matched into it and weren't backing off their opinions. And then but the Spanish authorities didn't think it was a good match, and they eventually found the actual, you know, somebody else who matched, right? You know what I mean? And that person was an international fugitive and is still today. So what this set off was, you know, really alarm bells around the forensic community, because fingerprints were thought to be really infallible, right? And that there hadn't been a mistake like that been made. And why was it, right? You know, and a lot of it had to do with bias that you're talking about. And confirmation bias can be something like your boss is the one that's asking you to review your work, right? His work or her work or their work. You're going to give it, it's like your boss sends you their homework and say, is this an A? Yes, right? No, it's an A, right? So that happens. And so what ETL Jor did after that had happened is he got 5 forensic experts, or 5 latent fingerprint experts, all very, very senior, board certified, all the rest, right? You know what I mean? And he sent them casework so a latent print and the potential, you know, match and exemplar to it. And what he didn't tell the participants in the study was that it was their own casework. They had already come to conclusions on all of these identifications or non-identifications already. And the only thing he changed was the contextual information that was included in the case. That was totally irrelevant to the fingerprints. It was that pointed one way or another that there was confession or that there was DNA or whatever. You know what I mean? And 3/5 of them changed their mind. Nothing had changed about the fingerprints at all, right? Just changed their mind because of the contextual information. And like for me, I thought that it was like, what more do we need to say? Shouldn't we be blinding the experts? You know, and one of the other findings that the NAS report makes is that you have to separate law enforcement from the crime lab, right? Because, you know, people, when they're viewed as part of the same team, we're talking about who the customer is in that, right? You know, earlier, the customers are law enforcement, right? And a lot of people go into the field like to catch bad guys, right? You know what I mean? And that shouldn't be the job, right? The job is just to do science. And when your budgets are in line with the police department, you have a lot of people who used to be police officers working in the crime lab, and you get what, you know, in Orange County the other day, right? It was like somebody who'd been an analyst there for 30 years, been shading all of her opinions for the prosecution, right? Because I'm sure thought she was doing the right thing, putting away bad guys. You know, so the cognitive bias, as you point out, is a huge, huge problem. For sure, I devote a chapter to it in the book.
There's actually legislation in California right now to separate the coroner's office from law enforcement for this exact reason.
So important, right? You know, I mean, in court, and undoubtedly happens in shaking baby cases all the time, is that where you have detectives that are actually in the autopsy room with the forensic pathologist while they're coming to their determinations, right? You know, it's the most biasing, you know, environment that you could possibly have.
So you discussed like Fry and the idea of general acceptance in the scientific community, and the issue obviously is how you define the relevant scientific community. What are your thoughts on like Daubert, which I think is the federal application where the judge is sort of the gatekeeper? Do you think shifting the burden to the judge would be a better standard of application, or like in the ideal world, what would you like to see?
So it's a good question. Thank you. I devote a chapter to Daubert, and the reason why is that, you know, I kind of like, the book tracks like 3 of my clients' cases and efforts to kind of parallel efforts to reform forensics that are going on while they're incarcerated and fighting for their freedom. And Daubert is kind of the first one that was teed up. And that was teed up by the civil defense bar, corporate defendants that were getting their pantsuit off all throughout the 70s and 80s on product liability and mass torts litigation, and personal injury exploded during this time. So a lot of unreliable opinions were being used by plaintiffs' attorneys, you know what I mean? And a lot of righteous litigation that led to, like, you know, Ford Pintos not being on the street anymore, that kind of thing. But a lot of junk science too. So they teed up this case that went to the Supreme Court called Daubert, and it looks like it should be pronounced Daubert, but I know people who know the Dauberts, and that's the way they pronounce it. So they decided, but it was and what the Supreme Court decided is, just so for everybody's information, is that they made this change, and they said that, you know what, judges, you can't just count noses anymore. You actually have to apply these non-exhaustive, but usually they are exhaustive, the 5 factors that are looked at in Daubert, that are basic science, like basic scientific principles that really all lawyers should know. And we're going to have a project that's going to try to teach all lawyers Daubert as a matter of science. And so at that point, and this was a study that Peter Neufeld did, in 10 years after Daubert, that Brandon Garrett and I followed up on later, showed that worked in the civil arena, is that judges began excluding more and more unreliable testimony in civil cases, but nothing changed in the criminal arena. The same garbage was being used, that nothing changed about it. And, you can read the cases, so it's not like speculation, and nothing had changed after the NES report either. Or, that the PCAST report, which we haven't talked about, but is, mentioned in the book as well. So if you're asking me which I think is better, I think faithful applications of either standard would exclude a lot of unreliable evidence. I like Daubert better because it really breaks down what it is to be good science. And if you can pass a Daubert test, right? If you can meet all the criteria, you probably have decent science, right? So I like that better. But Fry is still in New York and Pennsylvania and New Jersey and California and some of the most populous states in the country. So, but Daubert has been adopted, all over. most states have Daubert.
Yeah, I think we are
Right,
about
yeah.
out of time. I want to thank Chris very much for sharing. And also for the amazing work he continues to do, both at the Innocence Project and with his educational efforts and with this book. We are going to have Chris have the opportunity to sign books for anyone who wants to purchase his books. They're outside the door there. He'll sit and sign the book. And just before we leave, we'll play a short video, 2 minutes, I think, from the author of Senate Bill 467, Senator Weiner, just to let you know a little bit about his interest and why he's so passionate about helping us address this.
Hi, I'm Senator Scott Weiner. I have the honor of representing San Francisco and northern San Mateo County in the California State Senate, and I also have the honor of being the author of Senate Bill 467, working with the Innocence Project to make sure that we are not enabling junk science in our courtrooms as a way to convict people, all too often wrongfully convict people and send innocent people to prison. SB 467 creates a stronger gatekeeping function for judges so that if we have weak forensic or expert evidence that really isn't supported, or where there's a disagreement among experts, we don't just automatically allow that evidence to come in. For far too long, we've had a situation where certain kinds of forensic testimony, because it's come in the past, is automatically allowed to come in without having a strong enough judicial gatekeeping function and without really continually assessing, is this still valid science? Is there a legitimate dispute among experts? We need to strengthen that judicial gatekeeping, and that's what the legislation will do. The bill will also create a stronger pathway for people who have been convicted based on forensic scientific evidence that it turns out is now disputed. We'll create a pathway for people to challenge their conviction. This is really about a just and effective criminal justice system. When innocent people are convicted of crimes, it benefits no one. It badly harms, of course, the individual who was wrongfully convicted and their family and community, but it harms all of us because not only is it a societal injustice, but it means that the person who actually committed the crime is free, and that puts everyone at risk. So I want to thank you for your work to lead to a more accurate and effective and just criminal justice system. I look forward to continuing to work together to get SB 467 passed and then to move beyond to more solutions to this problem. Thank you so much.
Yeah, only got it because I love dancing.
Yeah, it's very very strong.
Okay, so I'm like getting.
You should watch it.
I'm super cute. They're amazing. I love their song.
Yeah, that's pretty. But I was like, oh, I'm like,
I'm such a dork. I just got it because I love what it says. Really? Yeah. Well, then I'll keep with the
you're very on time.
Very on
No,
time.
this is you're very.
I gotta see. Why have my kids not said anything?
Find if they're into the cake.
What's up?
Thank you.
Yeah, if you want MCLE credits for that.
Oh yeah, I would love those. Hi ladies, how are you? Hi, good to see you there. I heard you have a new buddy.
Oh my god.
Kevin, love
I'm
you.
in love with him. He's the best
But that's literally
human
wrong.
No, that's what I mean. No, that's
Isn't it amazing?
being so open and fun. It's totally fuckery.
He's my buddy.
Yeah.
He's my pal. I was just talking to him this morning.
Go ahead. He was hoping to come up early May.
Yeah, he was. I heard you guys like coerced him into coming up here before you all graduated.
Yes, we have a